All right, we'll give everyone a couple seconds to kind of trickle in here, and then we can get started on everything. All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Nutrien Economics. My name is Quentin Moorhead, and I'm the National Account Manager of Top Crop Manager in Potatoes in Canada. I'm joined today by Alan Blaylock, PhD, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. Today, during our session, Alan will discuss the many EEF choices on the market with different modes of action and benefits, as well as the considerable amount of misinformation. It is essential to understand each product, its mode of action, the end loss mechanism it controls, the time for which it is effective, and what the benefits are. Thanks again to Nutrien Economics for making sense of today's crop nutrition research. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after our live broadcast. This session is scheduled to run for approximately 1 hour. Alan will speak for about 45 minutes, and following his presentation, we'll open the floor for questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions tab found on your screen. This webinar has been approved for 1 CCA-CEU in nutrient management, so further instructions for submission will follow the presentation. Without further ado, I'll let Alan take it away.
All right, thanks, Quentin. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, if the case may be, if you're some other part of the world. Thanks for inviting me to share this topic with you today. It's a topic of great interest across Western Canada and well, across all of Canada, but particularly seeing a lot of interest in this topic in Western Canada. We'll discuss some of the reasons why and share some information that will hopefully help us all make better decisions. So with that, let's get right into it. For today's topic, we will first give a brief review of nitrogen losses. That's one of the reasons we are interested in these products. Talk about the different enhanced efficiency fertilizers themselves, discuss modes of action, because ultimately that's the critical point of understanding. We need to understand how each of these products works so that we can better apply it and make sure we're matching a mode of action to a solution that we're trying to get to. We'll give you a few performance examples. I don't want to make this a data dump. There are volumes and volumes of data on these products from throughout North America. We'll give you a few examples, talk about particularly some of the issues of interest in Western Canada. So with that, let's get into it. One of the things I like to start with is just a review of how we think about nitrogen management. And a lot of things are changing in our world around nitrogen. Lots of emphasis on nitrous oxide emissions and their role in climate change as a greenhouse gas. And so we will get into that a bit. That's a key point of interest right now in Canada with Canada's 30% emissions reduction targets. So we want to discuss that. In some cases, there are food processors who are requiring growers to meet certain sustainability programs or farm in a certain way. So that can be a driver. We've had lawsuits, some of these in the US, particularly versus farmers over non-point source nitrates in drinking water. And various agencies, municipalities, states, provinces adopting what we call nutrient loss reduction strategies, farming practices that can reduce nutrient loss, nitrogen loss specifically. And then just more emphasis on fertilizer management rules and political jurisdictions like provinces, states, municipalities, implementing rules by which they want farmers to farm. So all of this leads me to this statement at the bottom, that the idea that we should be fundamentally changing how we manage nitrogen, look at this in a different way. Are there ways we can do a better job rather than just our traditional practices, the status quo, and particularly looking at that in concert with, in conjunction with other conservation practices, how these things fit with different tillage systems, how they fit with cover crops, how they fit with, how do we manage nitrogen in the context of all of that conservation emphasis? All right, so I show this graph. I know this is for the US, but I've seen similar data for Canada, although not on a national basis. Basically, what this graph is showing is that the percentage of rainfall that comes in large rainfall events has been increasing. So what that does is creates a greater potential for loss. It's these major rainfall events that drive a lot of our losses. So if we're getting more of our rainfall in large events, these more extreme events, we have greater potential for nitrogen loss. And so hopefully, if we use these products right, it's my belief that we can partly overcome some of that risk, that we can reduce the risk of those losses from major events. All right, so let's just take a brief look at the nitrogen cycle. This is really just focused on the fertilizer portions of that, what happens to the fertilizer that we apply. And the three loss mechanisms that I've marked in red are three major concerns for loss. When we surface apply urea, it converts fairly rapidly to ammonium, which is in equilibrium with ammonia gas. If that's occurring at the soil surface, we can lose some of that gas by what's called volatilization. Ultimately, all of the nitrogen that we apply, or virtually all of it, ends up in the nitrate form. Those are biological processes. And nitrate is susceptible to two major losses that we look at: leaching, which is downward movement through the profile, and denitrification, which is loss as a gas, as nitrate is reduced to other nitrogen gases like nitrogen gas that we breathe in the air around us, as well as nitrous oxide and some other trace gases. So nitrous oxide is obviously a big concern. It's a relatively small part of that loss, but it's a really important part of that loss. So while agronomically, economically, strictly from an end balance perspective, it might not matter in terms of production, but it's a critical component of our greenhouse gas balance. So we do want to pay attention to that. All right, so I can take all of that, and the way I like to summarize it is that there are two basic nitrogen risks. There's the risk of urea applied to the soil surface that, as we said, can be lost by volatilization as that urea converts to ammonium. This is a relatively short-term risk. This process occurs over really a few days. And so during that period of time, right after fertilizer application is when we're susceptible to that loss. And so we need to manage the fertilizer around those losses and around that time period. So that loss typically peaks at about 3 to 5 days after application and then gradually tapers off. It's virtually complete at about 7 to 10 days in most cases. The other loss risk is the presence of nitrate in the soil. Now, this risk is season long, actually year round if the soil doesn't freeze. So that nitrate, anytime the nitrate is present and we have excess water, either ponding in the soil or moving through the soil, we can have these losses occurring. And as I mentioned, they're particularly magnified by specific rainfall or irrigation events. So this one's maybe a little harder to manage because it's ever present, the risk, and because soils will convert that nitrogen to the nitrate form naturally in an aerated soil. That risk is ever present whenever there's nitrate there, and there is almost always some amount of nitrate in the soil. So that's a little harder to get a handle on, and that requires a little more careful management maybe than volatilization. All right, so volatilization, or volatilization, I should say, occurs basically by two means. I mentioned surface application of urea, but we can also refer to the gas that might be lost through improper ammonia application. If we're running an ammonia applicator through the field and we see those white puffs coming out behind the applicator, well, that's an indication that we're losing some of that ammonia to the air. The white is actually water vapor that's condensing because that ammonia vapor is cold. And so if we have improper soil conditions, either it's too dry and cloddy or it's too wet and that slot isn't sealing behind the applicator, we can have ammonia loss there as well. So that's another mechanism of volatilization, but the surface application of urea is probably the one we're most concerned with. All right, so this is a study out of Oregon State University. It's looking at the amount of rainfall that's necessary to prevent ammonia volatilization. And in this study, you can see kind of an inflection point on that curve somewhere around a half an inch of of rainfall to maybe 3/4 of an inch. We need that much rainfall to move the urea deep enough into the soil that any ammonia evolved would be trapped in the soil rather than escape to the atmosphere. All right, so on the other side of that loss equation is this process called nitrification, by which ammonium converts to nitrate. And this process, again, occurs naturally. It's the process by which in natural systems, nitrogen is converted to nitrate and made available to plant uptake. Both ammonium and nitrate forms are plant available, but most plants take up most of their nitrogen in the nitrate form. This process is usually complete in a few weeks. Now, it's very temperature dependent. This is why we can apply ammonia in the late fall when the soil is cold, and it will largely stay in the ammonium form through the winter as cold soils tend to shut down most of that bacterial activity, most of that conversion. But as the soil warms up, this proceeds very, very quickly. And if we get into the early or late spring, early summer, this process can be complete in as little as a week. It is a microbial process, so whatever affects those soil microbes, those bacteria will affect the rate of this process, but specifically soil temperature, soil moisture, and an organic carbon source to feed those bacteria. Those are some of the main regulating factors. Here's a temperature relationship. You'll find this in many soil textbooks, but again, we're looking at the percent of nitrification. And if we look at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, that process is complete and it looks like just about a week. At 35 degrees, so just above freezing, that ammonium remains in the soil for many weeks, if not months. So it again, very temperature related, and we need to take this into account with our nitrogen management practices. All right, so managing nitrogen loss. First of all, we want to maximize nitrogen benefits while minimizing environmental impact. So if we think about this, just think about every pound of nitrogen that's lost from the soil is a pound of nitrogen on which the grower spent money that did not produce a benefit to his crop. So every loss can be an environmental impact, but it's also, every loss is also an economic impact directly to the farmer. So there are many good reasons to contain that nitrogen and keep it in the soil and get it into the crop. There are a variety of ways we can address this problem. We talk about, for our nutrient management, applying the right source at the right time, the right rate, right placement to reduce that risk. And so, for example, making split applications to apply the nitrogen closer to the time of crop need. If we have a risk of leaching later on in the spring or into the summer, applying all of that nitrogen at planting can result in significant losses because that nitrogen is just sitting there exposed to that loss. So when we spread that out through the growing season, particularly in wetter environments, that reduces the amount of nitrogen that's just sitting there in the soil. To reduce volatilization, incorporating urea or UAN immediately, putting it in the ground rather than on the surface. We can virtually eliminate that risk of volatilization by incorporating those two N forms, the urea-containing N forms. Or, and hopefully in combination with our 4R practices, we alter the fertilizer to manage the soil nitrogen form and the timing. For example, perhaps using a control release fertilizer or slow release fertilizer to deliver the nitrogen closer to the time the crop needs it, reducing the exposure, reducing the risk of those loss mechanisms. Or using a nitrification inhibitor to slow the conversion to nitrate. So these are some of the things we're going to talk about today, but as we discuss these products, we always want to keep in mind how they fit in our 4R system and manage those according to our soil conditions, according to our environment, according to our management practices to get the maximum benefit out of the products. All right, so why do we want to use these enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizers? Obviously, a big reason is to reduce nitrogen loss, and that leads to improved nitrogen efficiency. We may want to, with some crops, regulate the amount of nitrogen that's available at a specific time. There are some crops that are more sensitive to that than others. For example, we may want to have more nitrogen available later on in our wheat growth cycle to enhance protein development. or in a crop like potatoes, for example, very sensitive to the amount of nitrogen and when that nitrogen is available. And having too much nitrogen too early results in a lot of vegetative growth and delays the development of tubers. So there may be reasons to regulate the timing and the amount of the nitrogen. Sometimes we can use that to simplify our management. It may be substituting a product solution for a timing practice, for example. There may be crop safety reasons. Maybe we want to put more nitrogen with the seed and we want to safen our urea in order to facilitate that. But ultimately, we want to increase productivity and profitability, and again, keeping in mind the environmental component of that, which is ever more important. So these materials have proven to be a significant component of profitable environmentally sound management strategies, and a lot of these products have been around for decades. So we know a lot about some of these products. They're well tested, well studied, and there are new products coming on the market all the time. So we have defined categories of these fertilizer treatments. They have specified and defined modes of action, by and large. There are lots of different products, but they generally fit in a few broad categories. And so we want to walk through that this morning. We have a lot of proven products and technologies, but we also have some new things. And there are new brands of existing modes of action or existing active ingredients. So we just need to recognize those things. But our key take-home message today is that we need to understand the modes of action. How does the product work? What is the nitrogen transformation or nitrogen loss mechanism on which it acts? And what is my specific objective for using that product? What am I trying to achieve? If it's a crop safety issue, I may choose a different product. If it's a nitrous oxide emissions reduction, I may choose a different product. So understanding how to match that mode of action with the specific objective, the problem we're trying to solve. All right, so some common misrepresentations and these are things that I hear often. Oh, they're all the same. I'll just use whichever is the cheapest. Well, that kind of goes against our 4R principles. That's just simply saying I'm strictly shopping by price, and I don't care to understand how it actually works and what it will or won't do for me. Oh, I tried that and it didn't work. Well, let's dig into that. When a farmer tells me that or a dealer tells me that, I say, well, okay, how did you use it? Why didn't it work? What were the conditions under which you used that product? And maybe understand, because the chemistry works. The chemistry does what it's supposed to do. But when you say it didn't work, what do you mean by that? Did you not get the benefit you were expecting? Or are you thinking that maybe there was something wrong with the product and it actually truly didn't work? So let's understand that a bit more, because in the right situation, there's pretty good consistency if we have those conditions for that product to provide the benefit. So let's take a look at that. And then this last one, I heard a retailer say this to me, and we were having a discussion about nitrogen losses and product choices and what to use where and all of that. And at the end of the discussion, I think he was a bit frustrated in the complexity of all of this, and the statement he made kind of bothered me a bit, because I think we don't want to be this way. And he said, it doesn't really matter so much if I'm not using the right product. I just need to be able to say that I'm using an enhanced efficiency fertilizer. And so that's kind of the opposite of what I'm saying the take-home message needs to be. We do need to understand what the product is, and we do need to use the right product. And for the dealers and the crop advisors who are giving advice to farmers, when a farmer figures out that you're not giving them good advice, you tend to lose them. And for the farmer, you'll learn very quickly that if you're not using the right product, that can result in economic loss. And just for example, we don't use a broadleaf herbicide to control grassy weeds. We want to match these products with match that mode of action with the particular objective that we have. So again, keeping that in mind. All right, so here's a couple of quotes from a paper published by Dr. Cindy Grant a number of years ago, as a lot of this enhanced efficiency fertilizer market was developing, and a lot of new research being done. So basically defining what these products are. Enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizers can chemically or physically influence the movement and transformations of nitrogen in order to, one, improve synchrony between nitrogen supply and crop uptake. We mentioned that. Reduce the nutrient losses and improve nutrient use efficiency. So these are things the products do. And the effectiveness of the various enhanced efficiency fertilizers will be strongly dependent on the environmental conditions that influence the losses. So we're going to get into that and show you some examples of, places where they provided a benefit and places where they didn't. Okay, so in other words, another way of saying that is it's a fertilizer that's been modified in some way to, one, reduce the nutrient losses, and two, increase nutrient availability to the crop. So ultimately, the more we get into the crop, the less we have available to be lost. So this is what we're trying to achieve with these products. All right, so I'm going to break these out into several broad categories. There are first our slow and control release fertilizers, and there are different mechanisms by which these fertilizers release nutrients, either physical processes, say a coated fertilizer, or a biochemical process, and this could be even organic materials here. Compost, manures have these organic chemicals in them that contain nitrogen, and those released by biochemical decomposition. Or there may be chemical fertilizers that are simply complex nitrogen molecules that have to be biologically degraded to release the nitrogen. And then on the other side, we have the inhibitors and stabilizers, very popular products. The urease inhibitors, that slow conversion of urea to ammonium. So drawing that process out to reduce the amount of ammonia loss. And then there are the nitrification inhibitors, that slow conversion of ammonium to nitrate. So these do different things and work on different parts of the nitrogen cycle. So ultimately, lots of different products, different modes of action with different benefits. All right, so chemicals added to fertilizers to slow nitrogen reactions, the urease inhibitors. These generally control volatilization for about 7 to 14 days, depending on the conditions, depending on the concentration of specific product. This is typically the period for which they're active. Now, understand that we don't want to completely stop the conversion of urea to ammonium because the plant doesn't take urea up through the roots. By and large, it's needing to take up ammonium and nitrate. So we don't want to completely shut it down. We just want to buy a little bit of time. If we're going to be putting urea on the surface, we need to buy some time to get it incorporated or get some rain on it or irrigation or something like that. But we don't want to completely stop it, and certainly not for a long period of time. There are lots of brands of these products. The most common active ingredient is a substance called NBPT, and don't ask me to state the chemical name. I could probably get there eventually, but that's the way the active ingredient is known. Some brands that you'll recognize: Agritane, Nitrien, Limus, N-Yield, and many, many others. Because this is a generic compound, there are a variety of ways of formulating that. So there are lots of brands of this product that have similar function, that same active ingredient. Recently, Coke introduced a new active ingredient called Duramide under the brand name Anvil. So a little bit different properties of that product, claiming a little bit greater longevity. The Anvil product, I think, actually mixes the NBPT and the Duramide component. But again, there are lots of brands in that category. Nitrification inhibitors. These slow the conversion of ammonium to nitrate. They generally are effective for about 4 to 8 weeks. You may get lesser or greater control than that, depending on the conditions. For example, if we're applying anhydrous ammonia in the fall with Nitropyron, known as N-Serve, we get the added benefit. One, it's ammonia. Two, it's applied in cold conditions, and so it may last much longer than that, 8 weeks. But just talking about applying this in the spring, generally about a 4 to 8 week period is the expectation there. Nitropyron under the brands N-Serve, Instinct, or Entrench. A DCD, a compound that's been around for a long time. Nitropyron, I should say, was introduced in the 1970s, so it's a well-known active ingredient. DCD under some different brands is widely available. And again, Coke introduced another new product here recently under the brand name Centural. Active ingredient is a chemical called pronitridine. And then there are combinations of these. We have several products in the market, popular products that include both the urease inhibitor and the nitrification inhibitor. For example, combinations of NBPT and DCD. So we're addressing both of these loss mechanisms, or all three of these loss mechanisms with one product. So there's certainly advantages of that. Okay, so let's take a look back at this nitrogen cycle and the fate of our fertilizers. Our urease inhibitors work here on this urea transformation to ammonium, slowing that down, and the nitrification inhibitor works here. So if we're using the dual inhibitor, we're extending this conversion to nitrate by a significant period of time. All right, so let's take a look now at the slow and controlled release fertilizers. Those that release nitrogen by physical processes, those that release nitrogen by chemical processes, still largely doing the same thing, controlling leaching, denitrification, and even volatilization for a few weeks to many months. There are some products used in turf and horticulture that may last 9 to 12 months, depending on the design of the product and its physical or chemical makeup. So we can get a lot of specificity around these products just based on the crop and the geography, the environment we're targeting. Under the polymer-coated products in agriculture, ESN is probably the most well-known and widely used. Some of these other products, Polyon, Duration, new product from Purcell Agritech under the Percoat brand, has been recently introduced. These are lesser used in ag. The Percoat's a developing product because it's new, but Polyon and Duration have both been around since the 1980s, and so well-known, but not really used in ag so much. Has been some use in the past, but not so much currently. Then we have the things like methylene ureas, urea formaldehydes, urea triazones. There are a number of products in this category that are commonly used, but they're not used so much as a slow release fertilizer. They're used more as a foliar application. And in that application, they don't really function as a slow release in that they're absorbed and metabolized fairly quickly. When put in the soil, yes, they're complex nitrogen molecules that requires some biochemical decomposition for the nitrogen to become available. Fairly short-lived, many of these. The ones I've listed here are water-soluble compounds, so they're not overly complex molecules. They would degrade fairly quickly in soil. There are some of the urea formaldehydes, however, that are very persistent and can last a long time, but they're really largely too expensive for broadacre ag, so they're not widely used in agriculture in that regard. A lot of turf products there that have some advantages in turf and golf greens and things like that. Then there's sulfur-coated urea, which is a bit of maybe hybrid is the right term to use in terms of its release mechanism. The sulfur coating forms a physical barrier. So it is a physical barrier, but the breakdown of that coating is by biological processes. The sulfur, it's elemental sulfur, it's melted, and then that liquid molten elemental sulfur is applied as a coating, and that elemental sulfur then in the soil has to degrade to sulfate. And as that degrades, then you get a break or a hole in the coating, and then the nitrogen inside releases catastrophically. So again, a bit of a hybrid between the two. Not widely used in agriculture historically, although there was a lot of work done in the 60s and 70s looking at sulfur-coated urea, kind of a predecessor to some of the polymer-coated products that we have, but has not had wide adoption in agriculture, largely because of cost. So I put together this chart based on my own experience, some of the research that I've been involved with, some of the information in the literature. These are approximations, so not to be strictly interpreted for any specific environment. But if we just look at that urea hydrolysis process, again, complete in a couple days, with the urease inhibitor, we can extend that out to a week to 2 weeks. So slowing that down. With the nitrification, that's complete in a week to a couple of weeks, typically in soils where crops are growing. We add the inhibitor to it. We extend that out to maybe as much as a couple months. And again, keeping in mind that these processes are sometimes running simultaneously. Nitrification doesn't wait until all the urea is converted to start. So these processes do overlap. When we have the double inhibitor, again, looking out to maybe a couple of months, on the long end. And then when we look at the control release, again, this would be specific to the particular control release product, but using ESN as example, about 50 to 80 days, depending on soil temperature. So ideally, we want to try to match these to the time that we want to alter the nitrogen behavior. What time period are we trying to protect, and what are we trying to achieve with the product? Okay, so let's look at a few performance examples. So here, this is a collection of summary statements from Dr. Brian Beers based on some recent research. It's actually ongoing research. So these are some preliminary statements that Brian shared with me based on their learnings in the last few years. One of the things that they saw, now, again, some of this work was in Alberta, some was in Saskatchewan, and this is a multi-provincial site here, so that we're looking at some results over a wide range of environments. But in a lot of cases, the nitrogen rate had a larger effect on yield than the form of nitrogen. Now, again, keeping in mind that if we don't have nitrogen loss, then we may not get as much benefit from some of these products, and the benefits that we may be looking for might be something other than yield, and we'll talk a bit more about that. In these studies, 120 kilograms of N per hectare was about the optimum. Rates higher than that did not really produce additional yield increase, so or protein additions. So that was what they identified as the kind of the optimum out of that study, at least for the rates that were used. Key finding, which I think I've indicated already, the results were driven largely by precipitation. So in other words, these enhanced efficiency fertilizers become more important in higher moisture or irrigated environments. So if we're talking about Southwest Saskatchewan, Southeast Alberta, where it's often very dry, we have these drought years, there may be less benefit in using one of these products, but we need to take that into account and what the risk of that higher precipitation might be. And as we move further east, we go into Ontario and Quebec, and those environments where it's much higher rainfall, there may be a lot more benefit to these products because the loss potential is higher. Grain yield can benefit from the use of certain enhanced efficiency fertilizers in the dark brown soil zone. Those are one of their findings. And field scale conditions in the you think back to the last few years in Western Canada, and you think about the conditions that we've had. It's been pretty dry. And so the field conditions promoting nitrogen loss were not widely encountered in these studies. And so in the data, there's actually a pretty strong benefit for all of the fertilizer banded at planting right up front without any additional benefit of split applications. And so lower rainfall might explain that, or the lack of benefit of the enhanced efficiency treatments at those sites with low rainfall. But growers who suspect or expect that they're going to have nitrogen loss are in higher rainfall areas and can incorporate those enhanced efficiency fertilizers into their wheat production are not really subject to yield reduction, and they may have modest yield benefits in those environments. So just kind of some summaries of some of their recent learnings. We'll show you some more data from that study here shortly. All right, this is a study out of North Dakota. Yeah, I know it's across the border, but thought it would be relevant. This is spring wheat, and we have different timings of plant applications with different nitrogen sources. So we have fall applications as early as October, applications in November, and then a spring pre-plant. And you can see the nitrogen sources there: urea, ESN, and ESN urea blend, Super U, urea with instinct. Now, this is a sandy loam soil. And on the heavier soils, I would say there were some heavier soils used in this study, and we didn't see differences among the nitrogen sources. So we're suspecting possibly some overwinter leaching losses here, but you see using the control release in the fall worked well if we applied it late enough. If we apply it too early, then obviously we're taking a yield hit versus the late applications or the spring pre-plant. But with that November application of ESN, we're approaching the spring pre-plant yields, and there was a split urea treatment in here in which part was applied at planting in the spring with a later application. And so we're basically performing similar to that with that fall application, but numerically at least looking at that spring application as really being the best, although showing that the enhanced efficiency products can have some benefit there. All right, here's another example. Is from Saskatchewan. This was actually a grower demonstration, so not a replicated study, but you see a similar kind of thing. In this case, we have ESN, we have an ESN blend, and in this case, the ESN provided a significant profit. Now, part of this profit is the ability to put all of that nitrogen in the seed row at planting and not making the split applications. So you see the treatments there with some split applications, and that has an extra cost to make that second application. So you have to consider that in the equation. So one of the benefits that we mentioned, there may be objectives to using these products other than managing nitrogen loss. So I mentioned crop safety as one of those. With some of these products, we can increase the amount of nitrogen we put in the seed row. So when putting urea with the seed, that's a risky application because that urea produces ammonia, which can be toxic. And so we're kind of limited on how much we can apply. Here's a picture of a field study. You can see the plots there where even at 120 pounds of N per acre in a seed row, it looks pretty good. That's maybe a bit higher than we might want to go in some environments. We have a good seedbed utilization here, narrow row spacing. So that looks pretty safe. And so that may be one of the benefits. It may be the reason that you would use that ESN product. Maybe it's not about nitrogen loss. Maybe it's about the ability to put all of that with the seed in that application and save some fuel and save some other placements. This is an interesting study and this is 1 year of one study that showed something that is a bit speculative in my mind, but I have some evidence of this from some other studies, some corn and wheat studies in the US that makes me wonder. In this case, this was an extreme drought situation in which there was probably not a lot of opportunity for loss. I mean, the only suspected nitrogen loss would be these surface applications broadcast on the surface. But what about these banded applications? There was not an opportunity or not conditions in place for nitrogen loss. Why did we get the big yield increase with some of these treatments over untreated urea? And what we suspect might be the case with this is these treatments are controlling nitrogen availability to that early vegetative growth. Again, it's speculative. I don't have all the measurements to verify that hypothesis, but it looks like controlling the growth by controlling that nitrogen supply had a benefit perhaps in conserving soil moisture for the grain filling period. Again, it's one data point, but it makes me wonder if there are some possibilities there that need to be researched a bit further. All right, so let's look at the environmental benefit. There's great interest in the greenhouse gas reduction in Canada with the implementation of the off-calf program and possible cost sharing payments for growers. So there's a lot of interest here. So this is some data that, again, from Dr. Brian Beers, he shared with me from that study that I mentioned. And you look at this graph and you say, well, there appears to be a bit of an anomaly here with the UAN, but all of the rest of these, there's really not a difference between those treatments. I mean, these are not statistically significant differences. These are very small amounts of N2O emissions. And we look at the urea here at about 0.35, and everything else is pretty similar to that. So not really a lot of benefit here. So we say, well, why? Why did we not get that benefit here? Well, one, the losses are really small. And so when it's really small, there's probably not much you're going to be able to do to impact that. And what that leads us then to believe is that, well, the conditions for that loss were either not present or they were not certainly, those conditions were minimized. So we don't see the difference. Okay. Now, one thing to recognize, as I stated at the very beginning, and the quote from Dr. Grant, is that these enhanced efficiency materials are very much dependent on the conditions and the environment that's in place. So keeping that in mind. And now I'll show you some contrasting data. So this is a study from Dr. Gal. This was published not too long ago in Agronomy Journal from a couple of Manitoba sites. And so here we look at, and there's a lot of difference between the sites. So compare 2011 to 2012. 2012, again, these numbers are really small and not a lot of differences. But if we look at 2011, these losses are much larger. Our N2O emissions are much larger, and we see the benefit of the ESN and the Super U in reducing those N2O emissions. So considerably less N2O emissions from those products when those losses are occurring. But out here in the years where there wasn't much loss, not much difference. So again, contrasting results with different environments, different soil types, different rainfall amounts, and that's what we need to pay attention to. But when those losses do occur, the materials do and are providing a clear benefit. So as from some summary statements from Dr. Mario Tenuta on a series of studies that were conducted, and this includes that GAL study I just showed you. Over 44 site years, the double inhibitor Super U reduced N2O emissions by 40%. So think about that in relation to the Canadian goal of a 30% reduction. So, and looking at this next conclusion, the single nitrification inhibitor also a similar N2O emissions reduction. So if we think about that in relation to the goal, suggests that we might be able to get there simply with a change in nitrogen source or adding one of these products to the mix, at least in some cases. Over 10 of the site years, the urease inhibitor decreased ammonia volatilization from top dress UAN by about half. That's a pretty significant improvement. Yet for those same 10 site years, the urease inhibitor really had no significant effect on the top dress UAN and N2O emissions. So it provided the benefit it was designed to provide in reducing volatilization, but didn't really affect the N2O emissions. So that's meaningful. That tells us, that confirms what we're saying about matching the product with the loss mechanism. And for 10 site years, a double inhibitor with top dress UAN didn't affect N2O emissions. So I have to ask why that maybe didn't help anything. So, but there was no indication of that benefit with top dress UAN. So there's something else is going on there. Maybe that top dress UAN application was not subject to the same mechanisms as the banded or incorporated applications. But anyway, in that case, over a considerable number of site years, there wasn't a benefit there. So, but you can look at some of these things and sort out some things that you could say, okay, I could do that and maybe meet that 30% target by doing that. In the interest of time, this Minnesota study is basically the same as those studies from Mario Tenuta and the others. I want to jump to another topic that is sort of related and an area where we're getting a lot of questions. And that is this area of biologicals, biostimulants, microbial inoculants. Excuse me. There's a great deal of money being invested in this sector, billions of dollars flowing into the development of these products. This is kind of the frontier in crop inputs, and particularly related to nutrient management. Lots of interest, lots of new products. But in my opinion, the science is lagging far behind the marketing. A lot of these products have been around for many years, but the science has not been as complete or as rigorous, and there's still a lot we don't understand. There are a lot of different kinds of things included here, and you know, I've got a Venn diagram that I chose not to include, but just literally hundreds of different products in this arena. And so sorting that out is not a simple task. We don't understand a lot of the modes of action. We don't even understand in some cases what the active ingredients are. They may be mixtures of hundreds of different compounds, and sorting out which compounds are actually providing a response or potentially providing a benefit is very difficult. There's not a lot of independent third-party validation. A lot of the research you see is from the companies promoting the products. And so when we look for that independent third-party research from our government agencies, our universities, that's kind of lacking. We need a lot more of that work to really understand these. But there's a lot of interest in these products. Government agencies are beginning to accept some of these products. They're seen as soil health solutions. And undoubtedly, more science, rapidly developing science is likely to help that acceptance. Now, in this same group of active ingredients, and they do a lot of different things, most of them the effects of these materials are as plant stimulants. There are a number of these have been shown to induce certain responses in plants, a lot of them around stress tolerance, stress avoidance, some around nutrient use efficiency, some around water use efficiency, some stimulate root growth and development. So lots of different things. The question I wanted to ask is, what about nitrogen fixing inoculants? And this is something that we've been following. There's lots of interest in these. They're making a lot of noise in the agriculture press, in their trade magazines, and getting a lot of attention. So what about them? Well, I think the jury's still out. I think we don't know a lot. I've talked to several people who have begun to research these. There's still a bit of skepticism. One person I talked to said, well, what they had seen is they got the claimed benefit about 1 time out of 5. So, over 5 years, maybe 1 year out of 5. Another one said, well, in a lot of cases, they're really probably not even being used properly, in that we have growers who are growing high yields and they're applying healthy rates of nitrogen and then applying this on top of that. And probably if there is a benefit, it's being masked. And so the grower doesn't really know if they're providing the benefit. So one of the best pieces of advice that I saw was, if you're going to use one of these products, it should be used in a reduced nitrogen rate setting, but you should also do it in relation to what we call a non-limiting check strip. So put out a nitrogen rate that is adequate in relation to your reduced rate, and then use this product on top of that reduced rate to really define if it's providing a benefit for you. So there's lots more research that needs to be done here. And I would say, in any case, if you want to try one of these, do it on a small acreage, do it in a way with maybe some replicated strips in a field where you can really measure the response. Not one field versus another, not my farm versus the next guy's, not even split fields, but doing it in a way that you can really truly evaluate the response. So I think with that, we'll summarize by saying, coming back to this idea of merging enhanced efficiency fertilizers with our 4R practices, combining, maybe it's using an inhibitor with a split application. If we're going to be top dressing a urea product in season, maybe we should be using a urease inhibitor with that. Maybe one of these products might facilitate some more flexible timing or placement options, like seed placement. In other cases, it may substitute for another R, a timing or placement or source. So a lot of things to consider there. There have been lots of papers written on this. There's a great deal of research, lots of good review papers, what we call meta-analyses, looking at the results over many studies, even on a global scale, that help us understand some of these responses and the benefits of the products. With that, I think we've, unfortunately, I've left some time for me to answer questions that I don't know the answers to, but we'll take a shot at them. Here's the QR code for your continuing education unit. So you can, if you're using the CCA app, you can scan that code and get your credits. There's some contact information over here. My email address, our Nutrien Economics agronomy website, and our ESN website, smartnitrogen.com. So we'll leave this up here, and I guess, Quentin, we're ready to take some questions.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Alan. A lot of discussion, a lot of questions coming through here. So we'll try our best to get through as many as we can right now. First off, I think this question was to do with your first graph there. Urea broadcasting with absolutely no rain is 100% loss, he says, in 2021.
Yeah, so that's a great question. If I put urea on the soil surface and I have absolutely no rain and I have no dew and I have nothing to dissolve those urea granules, that urea might sit there. If I spread it out on my desk and I don't put any water to it, it's just going to sit there as dry urea and it will persist for a long time. So we have to have at least enough water to dissolve that urea granule to start that hydrolysis process. But I have never seen a result where it was 100% lost. So keep in mind, as it's converting to ammonium or ammonia, ammonium and ammonia are in equilibrium. Some of that ammonium will be absorbed by the soil, by the exchange complex. Worst case scenario, in a laboratory environment designed to maximize that urea volatilization, about 55 to 60% loss. In the field, I've never seen values that high. The highest values I've seen in field measurements around 40 to 45%. More typically, it's probably in a range under, say, conditions optimum for loss, maybe not worst case, but maybe more typically in the range of 15 to 25%, although recognize that those higher losses can occur. There was a recent Montana study where they were looking at volatilization during the winter on cold soils, and in some cases measuring losses as great as 40 to 45%. So they can occur. I don't think that magnitude is the norm, but they can occur. So it does behoove us to try to protect that nitrogen, either with our management practices or with an inhibitor. And the urease inhibitors are pretty effective at reducing that volatilization loss.
I think with that, you answered the second question here. So the question was, does volatilization urea nitrogen loss is supposed to settle back on soil again or not? And what percentage of loss did you notice in your studies or work experience? So I think we kind of touched on that.
Yeah, so I've answered the second half of that. That ammonia, when it's lost, it goes up into the atmosphere. It's not coming back to the soil. I guess if you had a rain at some point, there's some of that atmospheric ammonia that does get deposited back to the soil, but atmospheric deposition of ammonium is pretty small. So you can't really count on that coming back. So once it's lost, it's really lost.
Gotcha. Next one here. Is most of the the microbial nitrification taking place in an anaerobic environment? Does low OM and high sandy textured soils reduce microbial nitrification?
Yeah, so that's an important distinction that maybe I didn't clarify well enough. Denitrification is an anaerobic process. So in well-aerated soils, well-drained soils, we see very little denitrification. Now, we may have within an aerated soil, we may have aggregates. So soil structural units, aggregates that are filled with water. So the small pore space is filled with water, but the large pore space is filled with air. So we can have denitrification occurring localized within an aggregate in an otherwise drained soil. So yes, it can occur, but it's an anaerobic process, and basically those denitrifying bacteria are using that nitrate as a source of oxygen, as it were. I mean, in effect. And so they strip the oxygen off and in the process convert that nitrate to the other gases. So it's an anaerobic process, but we can see some degree of denitrification in a well-drained soil where we have aggregates that are filled with water. Now, it's also important to note that denitrification is not the only mechanism by which nitrous oxide can be produced and emitted from the soil. There is some nitrous oxide produced in the nitrification process from ammonium to nitrate. It's a much smaller amount than we would typically see in denitrifying conditions, but it can occur. So there are denitrification isn't the only mechanism for producing N2O.
Gotcha. Next one here. What kind of loss difference, if there is any, what kind of loss difference, if any, is there when it comes to liquid nitrogen and dry?
Yeah, this is a good question. Generally speaking, and there are exceptions to this, obviously, but just generally speaking, a pound of nitrogen is a pound of nitrogen. They go through the same process. Now, we need to consider what the form is at the time of application. For example, we want to compare urea to UAN solution. That UAN solution is only 50% urea. Well, that 50% is going to behave the same as if we're spreading dry urea. Now, again, if there's no moisture on the dry urea, it might be a while before it starts to react and volatilize, where with the UAN, the moisture is coming with it. But also recognizing that the other half of that UAN is ammonium, or a quarter of it's ammonium and a quarter of it is nitrate. The nitrate's not subject to volatilization. The ammonium's not subject to volatilization, but they are subject to those other processes. terms of leaching, you have immediately 25% of that as nitrate. That's immediately susceptible to leaching, doesn't go through those other processes. So you just kind of have to sort all that out. But in effect, in a lot of cases, it doesn't make a huge difference. In one particular case, you maybe see greater volatilization losses from urea, but in another case, you might see greater losses from UAN, and the same might be true for some of the other loss mechanisms. So in any specific circumstance, one might be favored over the other just because of the nuances of all of that. But by and large, not big differences.
Good. Do you have any comments on Invita?
Okay, Invita is one of these nitrogen fixing organisms that I mentioned. I didn't name any brands, but Invita is one of those. I think the jury's still out. I don't think we really know if and when they will provide the amount of nitrogen that's being claimed. Typically, they're claiming in the range of 20 to 30 or 40 pounds of N per acre contributed by that nitrogen fixing organism. And so therefore you should be able to reduce your fertilizer N by that amount. I just haven't seen enough data to say with any confidence whether they're doing that or not. Again, the data is largely from the companies doing a promotion without maybe a lot of background on exactly what was done, how it was done, and all of those things. So I'm still reserving judgment on those as to how well they actually work. Just don't know, I think, at this point.
Another comments question. Do you have any comments on ESN in extreme drought or conversely flooding?
Okay, ESN extreme drought or in flooding. So yes, there are some caveats here. If I don't want to put ESN on the soil surface in dry conditions. That's, it needs some moisture. Now, if we don't have at least intermittent precipitation with the ESN, then it is probably not going to produce a satisfactory result. So if you're in a drier environment, best to band it, put it in the ground, band it with the seeder, either seed placed or side row, mid row banded, much better application. And I didn't show you all the data from Dr. Beer's study, but he evaluated those treatments, and that banded ESN was much superior to other applications of ESN, particularly in dry conditions. Now, having said that, when we have good rainfall, we have a lot of ESN that's used as a top dress on no-till corn and top dressing winter wheat in the spring in higher rainfall environments, and it works great because there's moisture there. And so it works fine, and we don't see a lot of difference with incorporated ESN. In flooding conditions, again, if I don't really want it on the surface because there can be some physical movement. If I have enough rainfall to cause runoff and especially movement of residue, if I have good residue cover, it's not going to be as much of a problem. But if I don't have good residue, or if the rainfall is enough to move that residue, it's probably going to move some of the ESN with it. So would want to see it incorporated in environments that are subject to that risk.
What else do we got here? We got a few more still coming through here. So by how much optimum N rate may be reduced by the use of EEF? Are there any published studies on this?
There are some studies on that, and looking at some of the rate studies, I would say that there are some indications that yes, I can reduce my N rate. Now, for example, when I look at, and I need studies that actually show comparative rate responses between two products, and then I can really evaluate that. Typically, it's in the range of 15, 20, 30 pounds of N per acre. I might be able to reduce my N rate. However, what we have seen in our data when we do the economic analysis, that particularly in environments where there's a potential yield increase from using the enhanced efficiency fertilizer, that yield increase is almost always worth more economically than the value of the nitrogen savings. So if that enhanced efficiency fertilizer would produce a yield increase, I'm probably better to maintain my N rate, at least economically, and take that yield increase than to reduce the N rate to grow the same yield. Now, if we factor in the environmental component, the N2O emissions, that may change that equation to where reducing that rate a little bit, because it's the excess N rates that really start driving the big losses. So reducing that N rate a little bit by using an enhanced efficiency material might get us, the combination of the two might get us those N2O emissions reductions that we're after. So really, again, it's backing away from those excessive N rates. And if we're applying excess, we should be reducing those anyway. So it's kind of in that range that I mentioned.
Another ESN question, does banding ESN replace the need for split application?
Most of the time, yes. And in the beer study I cited, that was one of the things that study showed, that ESN all banded at planting was at least as good, if not better, than split application. So we have a lot of indication of that. Also in our US studies, we see a similar thing, but banding ESN at planting is probably the ideal way to use ESN. If you want to use ESN, that's the best way to use it. And yes, it can eliminate the split application in most cases.
Another one here. What is the fate of nitrous oxide in the air? If it is 300x or so stronger greenhouse gas than CO2, it seems we are doomed with 1 kilogram per hectare loss of a gas, unless it's washed out with air, in the air with rain or whatever.
So you probably need an atmospheric scientist. I will take a stab at this, but keep in mind that in the atmosphere, there are changes in nitrogen forms that are also occurring in the atmosphere with the electrical energy that's in the atmosphere, with the other chemical compounds that are there. So it's not like, okay, it's N2O, goes in the air and it's going to stay as N2O forever, because there is some cycling of these nitrogen compounds actually in the air. So I don't think it just is doomed to stay there forever. And 1 kilogram per hectare loss as a gas, that's even still below the IPCC coefficients that they assume in their models. I think they typically use something around 1.5. So we're still below that, but it is a concern because it is a potent greenhouse gas, and it's a really small amount of the atmospheric gases, but because it's 300x equivalent of a molecule of CO2, it is a concern. And that's why we're so interested in reducing those emissions. But I'm not the guy to answer the long-term atmospheric fate of N2O. I should look that up, I guess, and send me an email, and then maybe I'll look it up and see if I can find you an answer.
Get back to some people on those ones. We got 2 more here, and then we'll start to wrap it up here. So in drier region of Southwest Saskatchewan, what percentage of ESN / ureas and nitrification inhibitor added on urea with a blend like 32, 17, 5, 6.4? So
generally speaking, in our data with ESN, our studies with ESN, our data would indicate we really shouldn't be going below about 50% ESN, even in the drier environments. Now, even in a really dry environment, if it's in the soil, there's enough soil moisture to drive that ESN release. We don't see, from laboratory studies, we don't see the ESN rate slowing down until we get down close to that permanent wilting point. So if there's enough water to grow a crop and you have the ESN in the soil rather than on the surface, we don't see a limitation of soil moisture on the release rate. You have to get really, really dry. Now, and I showed the one example from northern Alberta, which was a drought year where it really did great, surprisingly. But again, even in that dry environment, Southwest Saskatchewan, we don't like to go less than about 50% of the nitrogen as ESN. And you start to get below that, now you start to reduce the benefit of having ESN in that mix. Now, if you're blending it with urea plus a nitrification inhibitor, okay, you may be partly compensating for that, but if you're in that dry environment, the nitrification inhibitor probably isn't providing much value if it's really that dry, because you're not going to have denitrification, you're not going to have leaching events. So those would be highly unlikely. But nonetheless, if you're using the urease and nitrification inhibitor on the urea to blend with the ESN, like say you're blending ESN and super urea, okay, maybe that blend percentage doesn't matter so much. You don't want to have too much ESN, but but the lower end of that is probably not critical because you're substituting another similar, I mean, I say similar in that, similar in its benefit, but not similar in how it works.
Gotcha. And then the last one here, we had a few more come through, but again, if anybody wants to send myself or Alan email, we can get the rest of these answered. In saturated soil, is all of the ESN available fast?
No. So again, in the case of moisture, we don't see a difference in release rate with the amount of moisture until we get to the really dry end. So saturated soil doesn't release really any faster than soil at field capacity or soil at 50% of field capacity. So the moisture, once we're above some critical non-limiting level of moisture in the soil, that moisture doesn't affect the rate of release. The moisture is essential to the process, but it's not affecting the rate. Temperature is driving the rate of release at that level.
Perfect. Well, I think that's it for now. I guess there's one more here. Someone asked, will we have access to a recorded webinar or this recorded webinar after the presentation? Yes, anybody will send this out 24 hours after. It'll also be on topcropmanager.com/webinars for your review after as well. This is just a reminder that this has been approved for 1 nutrient management credit. So like Alan said, the QR code's on the screen there. Please, and if you don't get a chance to do that, just send us your CCA number. We can get everything sorted out for you after that. And then I think that's it. So thanks for tuning into today's webinar, and don't forget to visit topcropmanager.com to view all of our previously recorded webinars. Thanks again, Alan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on today.